Hello, nerds. Welcome to the History Nerds United podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Today we have author Alexander Rose talking about his new book, The Lion and the Fox, Two Rival Spies, and the Secret Plot to Build a Confederate Navy. Fantastic book. Absolutely loved it. It's espionage in a way that you don't normally see, which is a lot of fun. We also talk about his book, Washington Spies, which became the AMC miniseries Turn. Really good show. If you've seen it, we talk about it just a bit. Had a really great time with Alex. Let's get to it then so you can hear how interesting it was. Alexander Rose, let's talk to him. And here we are, author Alexander Rose, talking about his new book, The Lion and the Fox, Two Rival Spies, and the Secret Plot to Build a Confederate Navy. Alex, thank you so much for coming on.
Well, thanks for having me on.
So, Alex, I'm doing a little bit of research on you, and just the start of your life is a little, you bounced around a bit, but you were born in America, grew up in Australia, but then also ended up in England. So my question is, when somebody says, "Oh, where are you from?" How do you even answer that anymore?
Well, I think you did actually forget that I worked in Canada as well.
Oh, I'm sorry about that.
But yeah, you had it right. I mean, I was born in New York, and I grew up in Australia and sort of educated in Britain, and then I made my way to Canada, and then now finally I'm back in New York. So I've kind of circumnavigated this great globe of ours. People ask me kind of where you're from, usually because I have a weird accent.
Yeah, you can't say you're from New York and then start talking. People are going to be like, something's off here.
No, well, sometimes people try and guess that I'm from South Africa. Well, I've never been there. So I think they're just sort of guessing wildly. Because I might sound a little weird. I am American. I did benefit from having sort of British and Australian and, Canadian influences. I kind of, almost parochial or, very sort of cramped, American perspective.
And you are a journalist and author, right? So did the journalism come first and then the, actual author part? Because I find that if you're a professor or a journalist, sooner or later you have to write a book. Is that like a rite of passage?
Well, essentially, I used to be a journalist. I mean, to cut a long story short, I was doing a doctorate in England in history, 1930s history. I got the early history of radar and fighter defense and things like that. I was offered a book contract, for about doing the Anglo-Scottish wars of the Middle Ages, about the Percy family, who were the barons and earls and later dukes, still dukes of Northumberland on the Anglo-Scottish border. Anyway, that turned out to be a huge, thick book because I just couldn't control the material. But at the same time, I was kind of training to be, an academic. But then I just kind of drifted into journalism at the Daily Telegraph in London. I mean, I'm talking really junior. I mean, just slightly above intern. So I kind of drifted into that, and I was also doing a lot of book reviewing for the pages and at the Daily Telegraph and certain other magazines and so on. So I kind of the academic part of this just kind of went away. So I moved to London and, I was a journalist there. And then I got a call from a friend of mine and who said, "Hey, they're starting a new newspaper in Canada, in Toronto. You ought to apply for it." I did, and without really expecting to hear anything back. And a call came through and they said, "Hey, do you want to be the foreign affairs editorial writer of this newspaper? And you can move to Toronto and we'll see you in 3 weeks if you want it." So I said, "Yeah, sure," because I was, young and free and didn't have any, didn't have a wife or a kid or anything like that.
And it's a little bit of a promotion from where you were.
It was a promotion. It was basically go west, young man, and seek your fortune. So it was a bit like that. So I just went over there and, I had a very good time. But at the same time, I was writing this other book, which would later become Kings in the North. I think they'd wanted 100,000 words. And it was now, when I finally finished it, it's like 350,000 words. And so I think we kind of compromised at 220,000 words. And it's this huge book. And sold, I think, maybe 6 copies.
7. I have it on the way, remember? No, it's 7.
You have 7, yeah. Yeah, you bought it secondhand, so I didn't even get a royalty out of it. It's okay, at least someone's reading it. Journalism, I felt, is kind of dying. This was around 2000, 2003, and there was this internet thing that was beginning to take off. And, so after that, I kind of decided that I thought I'd maybe write another book. And that's where the idea for Washington Spies came from. It was me just hanging around. I sort of left journalism and decided to write this book. And that's how it all began. So after that, I didn't hold another journalism position. I mean, these days I kind of do an occasional book review or something, but essentially the main business, so to speak, is books.
And Washington Spies, to say that did well is probably a slight understatement, because if somebody saw your name, they might say, I've seen his name before. I don't read history books, but I've seen his name. Washington Spies became the AMC series Turn. How does that all come about? Because I have talked to authors who their books have been adapted either for TV or movie. And what I hear very often is, I didn't believe it, and then either it got made and then it completely died, and I haven't heard anything since then. How was your journey with that?
The book came out in 2006, and it was okay. It sold all right. I was working on other books, and then I think it was 2012 or something, I got a call from out of the blue from a producer called Barry Josephson, and he said, "Hey, I'd like to, option your book, Washington Spies." And I said, okay, sure. Because nobody else was banging down the door or anything. And then I sold the option for, modest amount of money and never thought anything else about it. Because I just assumed, one out of every 1,000 of these things goes to TV. And then it was like a few years, and I'd almost forgotten that I'd sold it, to tell you the truth. And then I get another call from a guy called Craig Silverstein, who's going to be the showrunner. And they said, "Look, we're talking to AMC, we're revising this, we're doing that. We're actually thinking we're probably going ahead with this. So if you want to have a look at the script, let me know." So I said, "Yeah, sure." And they sent it to me, and I said, "This is great." And that was it. And then I didn't hear anything more for quite a long time. And then the news came through that, AMC had picked it up. They were moving ahead. They were going to make a pilot, and they would see how it went from there. If the pilot was a disaster, then that would be the end of it, right? So you'll notice that during this whole thing, like I had nothing to do with this project. It quite literally fell into my lap. But then they said, you want to just come along to watch the pilot, being made for a couple of weeks in Virginia. And I said, yeah, sure, because I'd never been on a TV set before. And then it began from there. And then after that, I guess I kept my nose clean. I gave some decent advice. And, after that, I was invited into the writer's room, and that's where I wrote an episode, per season for the next 3 or 4 seasons. So that's how it happened, really.
Well, you also left out an important part, Alex, and I'm going to come back to that right now. You are in the show at one point.
Well, yes, that's obviously the most important part here. No, that was I think in the 4th season. That was my desperate shot at fame and fortune. Neither of which have occurred, but it was essentially just it was like a little extra role, and I got dressed up as I think we came up with some ridiculous name, and I think I was Major Hewlett's sort of aide de camp. So my role was in 1 or 2 scenes was to just walk down the street behind him and I think salute and give him something and then walk away. There's no words because you're not allowed to do that, because that takes away a job from a real actor, not an idiot like me. So that was my great moment in film history, was saluting Vern Gorman in one of the episodes in the final season.
Now, I'm terrible to watch historical TV or movies because I'm constantly afraid of a term that I believe I've made up. I'm afraid my favorite books will be Mel Gibson, and the history will just be butchered by the time it makes it onto the screen, where it makes no sense. There's extra stuff that doesn't need to be there, and a lot of the interesting stuff gets taken out. But it sounds like this went into a black hole, and you're like, hope that turns out fine. I mean, once you started to see it and you read that first pilot script, were you a little bit worried about like, oh God, what did they do to this? Or you're just like, hey, it's something different. We'll see what they do with it.
Yeah, the latter. I mean, it was essentially, I thought, well, it's a good script. It's again, I couldn't even tell a good script from a bad script. I don't really know. As long as I get my name right. I think, I used to be of the persuasion about historical accuracy. It's very easy to say that, something, it's not historically accurate. But when you're working on a show, and you actually see it being made, and the compromises and the debates that take place to get something on the screen and to make it watchable for a mass audience as opposed to, a very small subset of, readers. You realize why certain decisions are made, and I changed my mind about it. Now, yes, you can have like screamingly terrible inaccuracies, Roman legionaries wearing Apple watches and stuff like that. But the general point here is that accuracy is a kind of a moving target. It's you can't really define it. Everyone decided that I was the guy responsible for everything. So I'd be getting all these abusive emails. But it was always, it's little things like, if someone's buttons on a uniform were wrong, or they were using the wrong glassware for 1780 or something like that. I mean, to some people, that's super important. And, but to others, I mean, like the other 99.999% of the audience, the people you're really trying to reach, they really don't care. They want to see characters, and they want to see, plot and drama and love and action and twists and turns and all that. And they want to see a spy show set in the American Revolution, which is a great dramatic era. So my view is it switched from being an emphasis on historical accuracy to, what's actually most important, I find, in period drama is a faith in or an attempt at historical authenticity. And what I mean by that is that whether the filmmakers, the makers, the writers can actually put an audience that really doesn't know very much about the period. You got to remember that. You highlight to them or bring home to them the difficulties and the perils and the difficult choices that people of that era had to make. You create this world around them so people can imagine themselves and realize that the past is, very, very sort of alien and strange. So you want to get a piece of that sort of strangeness of the past, but also parts of its familiarity. There is, certain shared characteristics that have come down, since the Middle Ages and things like that. I think that's actually more important is whether a show reflects the spirit or attempts to show the spirit of historical authenticity. What an emphasis on authenticity does is that rather than participating in these sort of desiccated debates over, is this accurate? A little bit accurate, very inaccurate, kind of accurate. I mean, all this sort of stuff that nobody agrees on anyway, is whether does this bring the past alive to a popular audience? Does it awaken their curiosity? Then I think that the job is done. I mean, I know in the Turn writing room, and I can't speak for other shows, and some of them are better than others. But in the Turn writing room, the show was taken very seriously. I mean, people were reading a lot of books about it. And yeah, there's little anachronisms in there. I mean, some of them are kind of funny. I was telling Craig about, I think in season 2, that I wasn't aware that the Chancellor of the Exchequer in England had his own personal hit squad. But Craig just kind of said, yeah, well, we need it for the drama. So, so you got to know your battles and which ones to win, which ones to fight, and which ones you just got to lose.
Yeah, I'm a tough critic, but even I'm not sending emails about glasses or buttons. But was it a hard transition to go into the writing room and do script writing as opposed to writing a book? Is it all just writing, or is it a different way of doing it?
I mean, it is a very different style of writing. I'm not some big expert on it. But it's always seemed to me that writing a history book is the best way to liken it to. I mean, when you write a history book, obviously it's prose. But screenwriting, really good first-class script writing is essentially like poetry. You have to fit as much as you can in terms of atmosphere, exposition, background, character, all this sort of stuff into as few lines and words as possible.
I mean, based upon what you said, Kings of the North, I'm thinking script writing must have been torture for you because you're like, I can give you guys 30 pages. You're only allowed to have 3, Alex. You can't give us 30.
If only I had 3. I remember in my first episode in season 2, it's actually much more talky than the other ones, the later ones. And this is when after it's been cut down, after I really compressed it. I mean, that's the historian writer coming out. And then after that, I realized, oh, that's what I did wrong. So let's just speed this up and just cut to the chase, cut, come into a scene as late as possible and leave a scene as early as possible. And it's kind of interesting because it's actually affected my own style of history writing. I mean, let's put it this way. I'm not doing any more of those Kings in the North, 250,000 words of detail. Nowadays, as you may have discovered with The Lion and the Fox, the books are much shorter. They run faster. There's a greater emphasis on story and character and drama and irony and all this kind of stuff. And the scenes are shorter, chapters are shorter. So yeah, I mean, it was a very interesting, learning experience.
And from what I remember from Washington Spies, because as we were setting up this interview, right, you had mentioned that book writing has changed so much, just even since Washington Spies. Now, I remember Washington Spies I'm a huge history nerd, so what I think is not necessarily what everyone else thinks. That still felt pretty tight. Now, everything about Kings of the North, right, a little bit more, you're also going over a lot more real estate there as far as what you're covering. But what are the biggest things that you've noticed about how writing has changed the past 20 years? Is that for everything where you're saying just shorter chapters, keep the book tight, don't go overboard on any background or anything like that? Have you noticed any other details, or is it really just kind of that part of it?
I think there's several aspects to this, and some of this is personal, and some of this is just on, a general level. I mean, for one thing, in the last couple of years, the price of paper has skyrocketed, and you'll notice that books are just, hardcover, paperback, they're getting much more expensive. And it's not just inflation; it's just the fact that paper was in short supply. I think there was a lot of strikes in Europe and in Norway where a lot of paper pulp comes from. I mean, all this sort of grand strategy stuff that you don't think about when you're actually writing a book. And so, yes, the publishers want to go shorter if they can. I think also there's just been there's a slight, shortage of attention span. I mean, unless you're writing some sort of big think book for Knopf or something like that, the publishers just want to get books in front of people who are excited to read them, and they want to just, they're competing against, TV, internet, podcasts, all sorts of different methods of entertainment and enlightenment. So yeah, books I think have to become shorter. They have to become a little bit more driven, a little bit more pointed towards potential dramatization, like Washington Spies, for instance, and this book, The Lion and the Fox. And in my recent experience, publishers just aren't interested in things like a history of whaling. They want to have an adventure story about a guy who goes out and hunts a whale with a harpoon. The point is, but that's a pretty long book. You'd never be able to publish that book nowadays.
I mean, Eric J. Dolan was able to put out Leviathan, but even he, I talked to him right before his most recent came out, and everybody's is shortening down. We talked about how he said he loves doing these big histories, but that things are tightening up and the ideas are becoming tighter and stuff like this. And that's interesting. I didn't know anything about the paper's more expensive, which means, hey, cut it down a little bit, buddy. Well, The Lion and the Fox, you were able to see my review on NetGalley.
Yes, thank you very much. Very nice of you.
I appreciate the book, especially because I say it in the review, and I want to be careful about it, because if I just say it as a soundbite, it almost sounds like a backhanded compliment. But this story could have been very boring if it's not captured properly. And also, going directly to what you're saying, I've also read a lot of books lately that it's a really good 200-page story, but it's 300 pages. And it's just, it's fluff, and you just completely lose the book. Whereas I feel like The Lion and the Fox, again, we're talking about, it is espionage. It is two guys on each side of the Civil War, American Civil War in England. And they're not slitting each other's throats and doing all this violent stuff the entire time, although there is some fisticuffs, I will say. But you have to really stay on top and make it tense when it's really two guys battling wits the vast majority of the time. How did you even come upon the story? What made you decide that this was your next book? Because I had never heard of any of this before until I got your book.
I actually had the idea, I think, back in 2010. I can't remember where I heard about it. It might have been on Wikipedia or, a reference to something else. And I was thinking about doing a Civil War book. And, I wrote it down and then I went on to other books. Every time I looked into it, going, oh, I really got to do more on this. I really need to come up with a proposal for this. I would look at the primary sources and I would go, this is just way too complicated. It was, because again, it's really easy to write long. It's much harder to write short. The problem with computers is you can type way too much. the fact is that, yes, it would have been very easy to have written a 700-page book about this whole subject. And it would have just been so confusing and these welters of details and conflicts. And so I couldn't work out how to break the story. It was just this huge number, because there's like dozens and dozens and dozens of ships. There are thousands and thousands of pages of official documentation published in the 19th century. So I kept on looking at it and then putting it aside, going, oh, this is just too complicated. And then talking to my agent about it, and he's actually one who kind of cracked it in a way. He said, look, you got to do it almost in phases. So we came up with the structure of the book, and sort of part one is the blockade runners. That's I don't want to get into too much detail, but that's how this this Confederate agent in England began. He was sent there to get a bunch of blockade runners so they could run a blockade and ship in guns to the South and export cotton. Then move into the raiders. That's his construction of CSS Florida and CSS Alabama. Okay. Then move on to the rams, which are these very powerful, essentially battleships made of ironclads. And once that happened, once you had that structure, and in a history book, structure is everything. Phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, things began to fall into place, because then I didn't have to worry about contradictions and hundreds of ships. I just had to kind of group them under, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. And once that happened, it actually just sort of magically unrolled itself. It was one of the fastest, I think the fastest book I ever wrote. Washington Spies was pretty fast. I think that was 11 months or 12 months writing and research, whereas this one was significantly shorter. This was probably about 8 months. Not only because it's shorter, obviously, but just because the structure was there from the get-go. That's what unlocked the whole thing. But I'd always had from the very beginning, I knew that it had to be Bullock, the Confederate agent, versus Dudley, the U.S. consul. And I remember when I was a kid, you ever read them, in Mad Magazine? They had that strip, Spy versus Spy, and they would always try and outwit each other, and they would usually end up blowing each other up or something, using, increasingly Byzantine tradecraft and inventions and so on. So that's what I wanted to have. I wanted to have it like a spy versus spy of these two guys matching wits and trickery and cunning somewhere that wasn't in America. There'd been enough, I think, Civil War books, about like Gettysburg. I wrote one with a big section on Gettysburg called Metaphor. So I do know about Gettysburg. I didn't want to have the blue and the gray, and I didn't want to have land battles. And this was perfect. It was like these two guys fighting their own private war in Liverpool, the greatest port in the world, in England during the Civil War. You see, so it takes you out of the conventional Civil War box, but it's still a Civil War book.
The history hands you kind of a perfect cocktail here, because on the one hand, you do have this environment where we're talking about you're in England. You can't just run around doing whatever it is, right? Because that's not a war zone. England is trying to stay out of it, and this is always in the background, which means a lot of the other things, the underhanded things that you'd have to do, you can't do, right? They're boxed in, like they can only get away with so much before somebody's going to get ticked and they might tip Britain one way or the other. And then almost literally, you've got Bullock, who is the Confederate, and honestly, he seems like more of a fun guy. He was with the Confederacy, so screw him, but seems like more of a fun guy, whereas Dudley is, I don't want to date myself, I don't know if anyone's used this, kind of a pencil neck. He's a man of letters, right? He's not going to go out and party and everything like that. And you have this, light versus dark, and two entirely different ways of going at it. And then they're locked in this struggle, and they can only do so much, and they have to use their wits. It's a perfect cocktail for the book, right? Which, as I said, could have gone completely off the rails. Because you could write 50 pages about which form they filled out to send to this duke to see if he'd do anything. But instead, what you get is you have this tight story where I remember a couple of times, without giving anything away, this is it. This is where, Bullock's going to get away with it, or this is where Bullock's going to get caught, and then just takes a hard right turn. And it takes a lot to do that, to find this and then also, say, hey, I'm going to keep it tight, keep it here. And it does help that the history puts you in a good spot for that, right?
Well, yeah, exactly. And I was also very lucky in that I had two such strong characters, as you pointed out. They're the lion and the fox. Bullock is, he is very cunning, he's very wily, he's very charming, very debonair, quite pleased with himself about it, rather smug about how clever he is. Whereas Dudley, he is a bit of a bore. He's completely humorless. He's this lawyer, upstanding lawyer from New Jersey, staunch abolitionist, very religiously Quaker and all this kind of stuff. He's like this, an unmovable object. He sets his mind to frustrating Bullock. And Bullock is constantly trying to find ways, and often does find ways around him, using all the assets at his disposal. But again, it's a very private war between them. And it goes on after the war too. I mean, there's like an epilogue where they're still fighting 10 years later, where the final blow is administered. It's really the story of these two guys who really loathe each other. Right? And fighting their own little private war. It's an important, and with very high stakes. If these ships had really gotten out, and if Bullock had really been able to do what he was trying to do without Dudley there to stop him, the naval war would have ended up very, very differently, and possibly the land war as a result. And also, Britain could have come out of her neutrality and thrown in her lot with the South in the kind of Anglo-Confederate alliance, which probably would have led to some kind of North-South armistice. What are the greatest stakes here? It's not just two guys running around trying to be clever. It's that they're actually fighting for something real here.
It can be very difficult because there's history where, okay, I am just writing a history of something. I'm telling you what happened. And then there's what this is, which is a narrative history where you're telling a story and you want to kind of make people feel emotions. And it's the problem that a lot of TV shows have when they do a prequel, right? Can you make the reader forget? We know how the Civil War ended, or at least I hope most people know how the Civil War ended in America. But you have to tell a story so that they forget that. So that each step along the way, they're focused on the story that you're telling and not sitting there going, well, sooner or later, I guess Dudley figured out something because we didn't lose the Civil War. Is that difficult? Is that something you're cognizantly thinking of as you're writing? Or is it just write the most interesting thing and hope this works out?
No, it's all about the story, not about the solution. I mean, it's not an Agatha Christie novel or something. There's no great twist in the tale like that. I mean, there's surprises along the way. But look, we all know, as you say, who won the Civil War. So obviously, Bullock's plan did not work out. But you can get that with any history book. I mean, as I said, I wrote this book, Empires of the Skies, about the Zeppelin Company versus Pan American. The airships versus airplanes. Now we all know how that worked out. Everyone has that, the humanity and the Hindenburg blowing up. So the airplane decisively won. And same with Washington's spies. We kind of know, Washington did do pretty well in the War of Independence. So I guess it all worked out fine. So again, I think you have that problem with any kind of history book that's not a novel. You just kind of work around it, and people will accompany you on the ride, knowing full well how this more or less ends. But there's, that doesn't, I don't think it really matters. There's so many surprises and twists and turns and revelations and just interesting characters and situations and the world that you create along the way. I don't think really people care that when they get to the last page, and then Lincoln was assassinated.
Bullock got his share of wins, and that was really shocking. Reading it gets pretty intense at a certain point where you're kind of like, he's getting away with a lot here. I didn't realize that there was this many wins on his side during this book, but I mean, he takes his shots and he lands a few.
Oh yeah, you don't want to have a book about one guy who's always losing and one guy who's always winning. I mean, that's just simply not very interesting. No. Bullock scored a lot of points, and remember, Bullock started the war with basically all the trumps. It was Dudley, the consul in Liverpool, who was on the ropes from the beginning. I mean, United States intelligence in Britain was really terrible. I mean, it was just awful. The Confederates were just running rings around them, and they had a lot of sympathizers in Britain. So you have to bring out the fact that what's actually going on in Britain at this time. What are the British saying about the Civil War? I mean, what do they think about this whole thing? So that affects everything. So Bullock is a worthy adversary. It's spy versus spy. It's equal versus equal, except that one of them basically got too clever for his own good, and the other guy, the Lion, just stood up, he sort of fought for what he stood for and, just moved indomitably towards destroying the foe. And that's how it kind of worked out.
A Civil War nerd superhero, Thomas Dudley. Who would have thought, right?
It's the Civil War the cinematic universe.
Well, this is Alex. We founded History Nerds United because a lot of the things we talked about here, history, is taking a hit. We're trying to bring it back. Maybe The Lion and the Fox will also help stem that tide. But a lot of people do say history is boring, right? They remember growing up in grade school, elementary school, and just hearing the revolution and George Washington, I cannot tell a lie, which Washington spies will prove that that's not true.
He told a lot of them, and he was very good at it.
He's very good at it. And what would you say to somebody who said to you, I'm not going to read The Lion and the Fox. History is boring. Why should I bother with your book? What would you say?
When people say history is boring, I think it's a lot, again, sort of stating the obvious. It's essentially the fault of what they've been taught, how it's been taught, and what they're reading or learning. I think once people actually read or learn well-told history, they begin to wake up and go, oh, this is actually telling me stuff I had really no idea. I mean, I would get letters from after turn. And, people, again, we've been over this, but, people complained about, historical inaccuracies, that we got this wrong, we got that wrong, blah, blah, blah. But at the same time, I also got scores and, dozens of letters. I mean, from high schoolers, junior high school kids saying, I really had no idea about this. And it just opened my eyes and I really found it fascinating. I've done my school project on espionage during the American Revolution. So when you get a letter like that, it makes you feel good because it's great. You've sort of, woken someone up. They've opened their eyes. And I think most people, if you open their eyes and let them see what is out there without, droning on about, politicization of history or, just these sort of ploddingly written academic tomes and so on. Yeah, I mean, everyone falls asleep. But if you tell a rattling good tale with fantastic characters and, and you create or you conjure up this wonderful world of the past, this sort of strange and alien past, and you tell people, where they came from and how things actually happened and why they happened, then you can convert anyone to the cause of history. I think people just need to read better history in a way, or at least historians writing it need to learn, that history writing is essentially a style. It's almost like a literary form. The best writers, like McCullough or Prescott in the 19th century, or, even Gibbon, Macaulay, yes. This stuff is dated. Yeah, I mean, sure, Gibbon's interpretation of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire is, it's pretty dated. It's not really real. But the fact is that he knows what he's doing. You're in the hands of a master. And again, it's better than a novel, but it's all real. So I think an appreciation of history as a literary form is extremely important to enlivening it. And again, that's not to slag. Some people go from then they jump to, well, all academic history is boring. And in fact, it's not. I mean, I couldn't do my work without a huge amount of academic history books, with, people who have gone into, decades gone into archives and dug up things and they come up with different interpretations of evidence. So, yeah, I mean, I use a lot of academic work and a lot of academic articles from various databases and so on for my own stuff. Nowadays, I just try and tell it in a kind of a relatable, dramatic, enthralling way, to the best of my abilities, that is, of course. So to answer your question, I think history can be boring if it's not done right. But if you do it right, then it's a real thrill ride.
Nope, speaking of thrill ride, The Lion and the Fox coming out on December 6th. Alex, thank you so much for coming on.
Pleasure. Thanks very much.
And that's it for this episode. Alex, thank you so much for coming on. Head out, everyone, and get his book. Really great read. You're going to like it. It's a lot of fun. Want to do one quick addendum. Alex forgot to mention he is also doing a newsletter called Secret Worlds on Substack. Make sure to check him out on there. Great writer, great conversation. Go out and find him. Trust me, it's good stuff. Reach on out to us at social media, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Go to the blog, leave some comments, listen to the podcast, leave some reviews, 5 stars, please. And if you're heading on out to Amazon, please use our link. You can find it on the front page of the History Nerds United blog. Use that. Doesn't cost you any money, but a couple extra clicks gets us a little bit of a kickback. Till next time, nerds, take it easy.